This file contains a workflow with a bracket part that has been split into inner and outer body in CAD, converts them into implicit bodies, then creates a lattice structure on the inner part with varying beam thickness, then merges it back together with the outer part. It may look a bit intimidating at first because the workflow hasn't been properly organized, so it's difficult to tell at first glance how this part has been created. The notebook is untitled, and there are no descriptions or comments to document any of the operations. To help you get more comfortable with working with blocks in the notebook, we will work to clean up this workflow and organize this notebook together. First, let's give this notebook an appropriate name and a detailed description of what the workflow does. Double-click to rename the notebook to bracket latticing, then press Enter. Do the same thing to add a description. Using sections, we can segment the different portions of the workflow. In this case, we will rename this first section to Bracket Geometry. For most workflows, geometry will be the first section because importing parts and converting them into implicit bodies is a typical first step. Two CAD variables have already been created, one for the inner and one for the outer part of the bracket, as well as one implicit body variable. To find out what this implicit body is, we click on the block and isolate the view by pressing I on the keyboard. We see that this is an inner part, so we can rename it Inner Body, and do the same with the two CAD variables. Now we know that the lattice was merged together with the outer body, so we can look for the outer bracket's implicit body in the Boolean union block. It is nested in there because it hasn't been made into a variable, so we'll right-click, make a variable, rename it to outer body. We will also add a short comment about each block that they convert the parts into implicit bodies, Geometry section is now done. We can move on to create a new section for the lattice. Right-click on the white line, then click Add Section. We know that this chunk is the final merged part and has the latticing process nested inside. So let's start making some of the things in here variables so that we can get a nicer overview of what's happening. We don't need to make everything into variables, just enough to define the big steps in the workflow to our understanding. This ramp block is used as an input for a thickness parameter, so this means that this is the block that varies the lattice beam thickness. So we'll right-click and make this a variable called ramp. Two graph lattice type blocks are nested as well in a thicken body block, which turns it into an implicit. So we can isolate this to see that it is our lattice. We'll right-click and make a variable and call this lattice. What we have left is a smaller Boolean union block with Boolean intersect as one of the input items that gets merged together. So we know that it definitely has something to do with the lattice structure. Usually Boolean intersect is used as a cleanup step. So if we isolate this block by pressing I on the keyboard, then turn on the outer bracket visibility, let's look at the top of the bracket. We see that the lattice from the Boolean intersect block does not have any parts coming outside of the initial volume that we brought in from CAD, while the lattice from the thicken body block does. Coming back to this Boolean intersect block, we'll right-click and make it a variable and call it trimmed lattice. We can now also rearrange the ramp block to down below the lattice block so that it is in an order that makes sense to vary the beam thickness after creating that lattice. We can now go back and add comments to each of these blocks that we have just now made into variables and rearranged to distinguish the chronological steps of this workflow. This is so that we can properly document what exactly each step does. Then we'll add in a last section by right-clicking on the white line and call this final part. We'll also make the Boolean union block a variable by right-clicking and choosing make variable, and then renaming it final part. Now, if there are certain parameters that we know we will later want to be able to easily see and change, we should also make them variables so that they are pulled outside of the nested blocks and we don't have to go in and find them. So we made the unit cell type of the lattice into a variable and commented with the details, so we can easily go in and change the type of unit cell for this lattice. We can also go in and make the scale of the lattice a variable, then rename this to lattice size, and comment with any details. We can then collapse every block to keep the notebook organized. Since we have everything that we need to change outside and visible.